He walked into that party with confidence, the only black CEO in the room, carrying years of hard work and dignity on his shoulders. But within minutes, whispers turned to laughter, and respect turned to humiliation. They didn't see his success, only the color of his skin. Stripped of dignity in front of everyone, he was forced out, mocked as if he didn't belong. But what they didn't know was that their cruel laughter would soon cost them everything. How does a man rise after being torn down so brutally? For years, David Carter had built his reputation brick by brick. From a modest childhood to becoming one of the youngest black CEOs in the country, his story was one of resilience and relentless determination. Colleagues described him as sharp, disciplined, and quietly generous, the kind of leader who remembered every name, every struggle. To many, David was proof that barriers could be broken. That night, he wasn't in a boardroom or giving a keynote speech. He was simply attending a high-profile corporate celebration, a place where his success should have been honored. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with chatter and champagne. Yet David couldn't shake the subtle stares, the measured tones, the unspoken words that lingered like smoke in the room. Still, he carried himself with calm, confidence, dressed in a tailored suit that mirrored his achievements. He was used to being the only one who looked like him in spaces like these. But this night felt different. Something in the air whispered tension. He didn't know it yet. But this gathering was not just another corporate event. It was the stage where hidden prejudice would surface, and where his dignity would be tested in front of everyone. The celebration was supposed to be a night of recognition, a gathering of the city's most powerful executives and rising stars. David Carter blended into the crowd at first. Handshakes, polite smiles, short conversations about business. But as the night wore on, subtle shifts in tone became impossible to ignore. Laughter broke out when he approached certain groups, only to quiet as soon as he drew near. Compliments carried a sharp edge, disguised as jokes. "Impressive for someone like you," one man muttered, raising his glass with a smirk. David had endured these moments before, those cutting words dressed in politeness. But tonight, the whispers felt louder, the stares more deliberate. He caught sight of a small circle near the stage. Executives who controlled millions in investments. Men who prided themselves on tradition and exclusivity. They eyed him with disdain, as if his presence disrupted something sacred. Then it happened. As the host invited leaders to the stage for recognition, David's name was called. He straightened his suit and began to walk forward. But before he could reach the podium, one of the executives loudly cleared his throat. "Does he really belong up here?" The words weren't shouted, but they carried across the room like thunder. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed. Another voice chimed in, mocking his background, questioning how someone like him had climbed so high. Within seconds, what should have been applause turned into ridicule. The crowd split, some shifting uncomfortably, others feeding the humiliation. Murmurs turned to laughter, then to taunts. And in the middle of that glittering ballroom, David was left standing alone. Security, acting under whispered instructions, stepped forward and guided him out. Not with force, but with enough firmness to make clear he was no longer welcome. Every step toward the exit burned with shame. He could feel hundreds of eyes following him, judging, mocking, dismissing. For years, he had fought against barriers, proving his worth again and again. Yet here he was, stripped of dignity in the span of minutes. His achievements reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, a quiet, searing fire. As the ballroom doors closed behind him, David realized this was not the end of the story. The very people who laughed at him, who mocked his place among them, had no idea what power he still held. And what he planned to do next would silence their laughter forever. The humiliation of that night could have broken him. Many expected it, too. But David Carter was not a man to vanish quietly into the shadows. Days later, the same executives who mocked him sat comfortably in their offices, laughing over the memory of their cruelty, convinced they had reminded him of his place. What they didn't know was that David held the ultimate authority. He wasn't just another guest at the party, he was their employer. The boardroom was silent when he entered, papers in his hand, his expression calm but unyielding. One by one, he called their names, the very men who had sneered, laughed, and orchestrated his public removal. Their faces shifted from arrogance to disbelief, then to fear. In that moment, every chuckle, every whisper, every smirk was laid bare under the weight of consequence. With deliberate precision, David stripped them of their titles, their privileges, their power. Contracts were terminated, positions dissolved. These were not symbolic gestures. They were final. Security escorted them out, just as he had been escorted days before. But this time, it wasn't humiliation. It was justice. For once, the silence belonged to him. The same men who had treated his presence as an intrusion now felt what it meant to be dismissed, discarded, unwanted. And in that sharp reversal, David reclaimed not only his dignity, but his voice. The humiliation they intended as his downfall had become their undoing. But the question still lingered. Would this act of justice be enough to change the system that allowed it to happen in the first place? When the last executive was escorted out, David Carter remained alone in the boardroom. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of justice. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to stand tall without the weight of their mockery pressing against him. He had reclaimed his dignity. The scars of that night at the party would never fully fade. David's revenge had been swift and absolute, but he knew his story was bigger than his own victory. What happened to him was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system where success could still be overshadowed by prejudice, where skin color could still eclipse achievement. His firing of those who mocked him sent a message, but it did not erase the truth that countless others still face similar humiliations without the power to fight back. The impact of his decision rippled outward. Some praised him for his strength. Others whispered in discomfort, unwilling to confront the ugliness beneath the laughter they had once shared. And yet, his actions forced a reckoning. At least for a moment, people were reminded that racism doesn't always wear uniforms or shout in the streets. Sometimes, it wears suits and hides behind champagne glasses. David's story leaves us with a haunting question. How many more moments like his must happen before we admit the truth? Success should never have to be defended. Dignity should never be optional. As you hear his story, ask yourself, if laughter can destroy a man in minutes, what could solidarity, respect, and courage build instead? If you like this story, so please join the conversation by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Your voice matters, and together we can shine a light on stories that should never be forgotten.